Exeter Academy Boarding School in New Hampshire, whose notable graduates include some of the most influential names in 20th century American history, from Ulysses S. Grant Jr. to Mark Zuckerberg. Minton had spent a significant portion of his entire career passing for white, as did another Sigma Pi Phi founder, Algernon B. Jackson. Another mixed-race man who sported a blonde coif, an ode to his Caucasian mother, who was influential in his education at predominantly white institutions, like the University of Indiana, for which she was a member of the faculty. Jackson went on to prosper as a surgeon, becoming the first so-called black surgeon at Philadelphia Polyclinic Hospital, an exclusively white hospital, and then working as chief surgeon for Mercy Hospital in Philadelphia, where he worked for 20 plus years before taking a position at Howard. He left as hospital superintendent, a position which would be filled by his Boulay brother, Henry McKee Minton. These two men ran in the most privileged circles in Black America and sought to bind men of like qualities to an organization and to develop contacts for the improvement of their careers. Together with 4 other men, they founded the Boulay. In the beginning, Sigma Pi Phi was comprised of mostly physicians. One of these physicians, Robert Abel, was the brother of renowned architect Julian Abel. The Abel brothers were from a prominent Black Philadelphia family, whose roots lay in the establishment of the African Methodist Episcopal Church, which was the first Black Episcopal church in the United States. Although the historical narrative elaborates little on the life and times of Robert, Julian seems to have lived a more noteworthy life. Julian is an architect to some of the most venerated structures of American academia, including the Widener Library on the campus of Harvard, the Philadelphia Central Library, the Philadelphia Museum of Art, which includes the steps from the movie Rocky, the Allen Administration Building on the campus of Duke University, as well as Duke University Chapel, and most notably on the campus Cameron Indoor Stadium. The Abel family was some of the most illustrious Blacks in Philadelphia. Eugene Moneyman Henson was another Philadelphia-based physician who joined the ranks of the light-skinned assassins. Additionally, Big Eddie Throat Baby Howard, a master Masonic medicine man in his own right, had already established a practice in Philadelphia by the year 1870. Being the first Black graduate from Harvard Medical College, Howard was commissioned by the 12th Infantry of Pennsylvania, ascending to the rank of Surgeon General. To boot, Big Edwin Clarence Joseph Turpin Howard helped found Frederick Douglass Memorial Hospital in Philadelphia in 1895, the first Black hospital in the city, likewise as he did with Mercy Hospital, along with his other Boulay brethren.
And you say that he was only one of 3 people in Ghana that had a ZIL limousine.
Correct, yes. The Russians had great admiration for Du Bois. He was quite useful to them. And indeed, more than that, Khrushchev and Du Bois hit it off famously in their several meetings. And so the Russian ambassador was instructed to give Du Bois that behemoth limousine, the ZIL. And so he had one, the ambassador, of course, and then Nkrumah, the president of Ghana, also.
You say that he got cables on when he died, were sent from Mao Zedong, Zhou Enlai, Nikita Khrushchev, and that in attendance was Gus Hall, the American Communist Party. Why did they like him so much, or why did they want to pay homage to him?
Well, his value to the Soviet cause was enormous. Here was the most impressive African-American intellectual, the man who was deemed widely to be the father of Pan-Africanism, the founder of the Civil Rights Movement. And now in the 50s, his politics were such that the Soviet Union thought it appropriate to bestow upon him the Lenin Peace Prize. And
This nigga said Lenin Peace Prize. That's an oxymoron. This nigga killed like 1 trillion people.
58, that was the time when Paul Robeson's passport was restored. A whole raft of people were once again able to travel. He went to the Soviet Union and was treated like a head of state virtually. Then to China, the same sort of treatment. And so if the Soviet Union hoped to encourage people within the United States and elsewhere to look upon Marxism, communism, and scientific socialism with increasing favor, then Du Bois was useful in that regard.
Another face in this frilly flock of Philadelphia physicians was perhaps the blackest of them all, Little Dick Warwick. The Warwick family, another prominent Negro family in Philadelphia, whose roots were also tied to the abolitionist movement and the creation of the African Methodist Episcopal Church. As a result of their relationships and roles in abolitionist reformation, which included the Christianizing of blacks through the Methodist Church, this small Negro contingent out of Philadelphia was considered the Black American aristocracy. After the group's establishment in 1904, the Boulets later expanded into Chicago in 1907 and Baltimore the following year in 1910, expanding south to Memphis and later into cities like St. Louis, Kansas City, Detroit, and Atlanta. Being considered for selection into Sigma Pi Phi was contingent first upon education and then excellence in one's field. But probably the most important qualification was legacy. For 2 decades, the Boulets aggressively recruited all of the most prominent black families and professionals across the country for membership, hoping by which they could establish a black hierarchy. Over time, the membership became less of an excellent-based requirement and more of a legacy-based, which caused concerns that the standards for membership of inherited status wouldn't retain the quality of its founders, whom were considered by the elite as the most excellent of men. Yet, to be fair, all of the founding members of the Boulets had also inherited legacy status through societies founded prior to the Boulets, such as the Ugly Club in New York and the Free African Society in Philadelphia. The Negroes of the Northeast sought to separate themselves from the so-called lower-class Negroes, and the Methodist Church would make over the paupers of the plantation into the princes of the pulpit. 2 of these princes of the pew were Richard Allen, founder of the African Methodist Episcopal Church, and Absalom Jones. Both of these men were born into slavery and Christianized by their Methodist overseers for the purposes of evangelizing slaves. In 1787, these men found the Free African Society, which at its inception was a religious institution which led to the establishment of the first independent black church in America. Richard Allen was born a slave on the plantation of prominent Philadelphia politician and Supreme Court Judge Benjamin Chew, who also had been a close personal friend of George Washington. Richard Allen was eventually sold to Stokely Sturgis, a white Methodist abolitionist, and while under the thumb of Sturgis, Richard Allen became a Methodist and began spreading gospel to the enslaved blacks. Eventually, Allen became a preacher at St. George's Episcopal in Philadelphia, a predominantly white church, but his services were restricted to sunrise sermons. This was around the time he and Absalom Jones founded the Free African Society, although he nor Jones were born free or African. At the root of their Christianization was slavery, and at the root of their slavery were men teaching them religion. But what was at the root of the men teaching them religion? Christianity wasn't inherently African, so why were these men amalgamating European philosophy with African identity? Did these men have any credible historical foundation for such claim? Both men born slaves in Delaware and taught their history and religion by whom? So what expectation should one have for Negroes who were indoctrinated by their oppressors to the point of claiming false identity to justifiably found something considered independent and black? The black bourgeoisie of Philadelphia were a product of abolitionist Christian propaganda, whose purpose is to keep the black masses in a state of perpetual confusion and ignorance. What better way than teaching Christianity to house niggas, and then having some of those house niggas propagate the black masses with futile race rhetoric from docile, dainty Negroes who despise their own people. The mindfuckery is extremely well calculated. Create a class of uppity conformist Negroes and use your resources to champion these individuals as the brightest and best. Another one of the illustrious Philly Negroes was a man by the name of James Forten, who was actually born free and became one of, if not the most influential of all the Negroes in Philadelphia. James Forten had served in the Navy as a privateer during the Revolutionary War. He was taken prisoner by the British Royal Navy during his stint, but was later released after being imprisoned for 9 months. He returned to Philadelphia and apprenticed as a ship sailmaker in a business previously worked by his deceased father, who had died on the job under business owner Robert Bridges. After the retirement of Bridges, Forten, who had become a foreman and Bridges' best employee, took a loan and purchased the business in 1798. In 1810, Forten invented a tool used to maneuver large cells, therefore making them easier to cut and sew. As a result, his business prospered, and soon James Forten's business made him one of the wealthiest men in Philadelphia, regardless of race. In the late 1700s and early 1800s, many abolitionists and slave masters bounded together for a single master plan to solve the black problem in American society. This began the first so-called Back to Africa movement, in which black Americans, some formerly enslaved, would move to West Africa and countries like Liberia and Sierra Leone in order to colonize these lands free of racial discrimination. This idea, proposed by the American Colonization Society, an organization supported by notorious slave owners like Kentucky's Henry Clay, was outright rejected by black Americans, who claimed they had been American and had no African association. Quote, from the problem of slavery in the age of emancipation. Forten had supported Paul Cuffey, a Boston shipbuilder who in 1815 transported 38 free blacks to Sierra Leone with the idea they could make a better life where not impeded by white racism. He was well aware of continuing problems due to harsh discrimination against blacks in the United States. To address community concerns and discuss potential for colonization, James Forten worked with Bishop Richard Allen of the African Methodist Episcopal Church, the first independent black denomination in the United States, Absalom Jones and James Goulchester, to organize a meeting on this topic in Philadelphia. Their announced meeting in January 1817 at Bethel AME Church drew 3,000 attendees from Philadelphia. Hearing the strong views of this public forced a dramatic turning point for these leaders. By this time, most free blacks and slaves had been born in the United States and claimed it as their own, with their own families. At the meeting, Forten called for a vote asking who favored colonization. Not one man said yes. When he asked who was against it, the crowd resounded with a no that made the hall ring. All claimed the U.S. as their own and wanted to gain their full civil rights as citizens. After that meeting, Fortin and the ministers strongly opposed the ACS, and Fortin later converted William Lloyd Garrison, a younger white abolitionist from Boston, against the colonization schemes. Following the January meeting, Fortin helped draft a resolution of the sense of the public, which he and other leaders sent to the Pennsylvania congressional delegation. In August, they published a longer address to the inhabitants of the city and county of Philadelphia, which attacked colonization. End quote. Perhaps James Fortin was the most influential black in the entire country, and he adamantly opposed relocating to Africa, as did many of his countrymen. Fortin had not been born a slave and did not inherit his status. He was a self-made man, to the utmost respect of his peers, which he earned by representing them to the opposition of their white so-called friends. Abolitionists and Quakers, along with Methodists, held themselves as the liberators of blacks in America. Among their objectives, concocting a scheme to displace black Americans from their homeland. It must be noted that the black population in America was significant prior to colonialism. The majority of the enslaved population were captured indigenous prisoners of war, whom had their land forcibly taken by pre-colonial European powers, predominantly the French in Canada and in Middle America, the Spanish in the South and the West, and the British in the East. The Virginia Slave Act imposed the right of Christian authority over anyone captured and held in bondage. Quote from the Virginia Slave Act, Henning's Statutes at Large, Volume 2, page 491. Jumping ahead to the middle. And whereas also those Indians that are taken in war or otherwise by our neighboring Indians, confederates or tributaries to his majesty, and this his plantation of Virginia, are slaves to the said neighboring Indians that so take them, and by them are likewise sold to his majesty's subjects here as slaves. Be it therefore enacted by the governor council and the burgesses of this General Assembly, and it is enacted by the authority aforesaid, that all the said recited act of the 3rd of October 1670 be, and is hereby repealed and made utterly void to all intents and purposes whatsoever. And it be further enacted by the authority aforesaid, that all servants except Turks and Moors, whilst in amity with his majesty, which from and after publication of this act shall be brought or imported into this country, either by sea or land, whether Negroes, Moors, mulattoes, or Indians, who in whose parentage and native country are not Christian at the time of their first purchase of such servant by some Christian, although afterwards and before such their importation and bringing into this country, they shall be converted to the Christian faith. And all Indians, which shall hereafter be sold to our neighboring Indians, or any other trafficking with us as for slaves, are hereby adjudged, deemed, and taken, and shall be adjudged, deemed, and taken to be slaves to all intents and purposes, any law, usage, or custom to the contrary notwithstanding. End quote. From Henning's Statutes at Large, Volume 2, page 491, 1670, Virginia Slave Act. The first so-called African-American leaders in American history were essentially Christian and Zionist installed puppets, many of them having immigrant backgrounds. These people were used as instruments to mold the black narrative of American history and even black history in general. Indoctrinated by Christian abolitionists under the guise of anti-slavery, when their true motives were to use these token blacks to propagate Christianity and Pan-Africanism. No less noteworthy are the intellectual black families of the South, similar to the Warwicks who moved north during Reconstruction in hopes to obtain prominence within the northern black aristocracy. Prestigious black landowners and businessmen from the South often enrolled their children in northern elite educational institutions such as Harvard and other Ivy League schools. The completion of their degrees held an unequal quality of comparison and guaranteed their position in the social caste system. The education, or rather indoctrination disparity between blacks during Reconstruction fostered the Hegelian dispute at the heart of the philosophy for black progressiveness. Two opposing schools of thought were at play. Social liberalism, a philosophy championed by the so-called talented 10th and the Boule, and self-actualization, a philosophy championed by Booker T. Washington and Marcus Garvey. Each of these men gaining power and influence through their relationships with wealthy white men. This would introduce the three-headed monster of the black Hegelian deception: integration, segregation, or separation. On the next episode of Boule, we will investigate the philosophies of Marcus Garvey and Booker T. Washington, and their opposition to W.E.B. Du Bois. We will also learn more about the roots of Sigma Pi Phi and their connection to black fraternities and Freemasonry.